The lecture you are about to hear was released to Sound Seminars by Rice University as the third presentation in the symposium, Behaviorism and Phenomenology, Contrasting Bases for Modern Psychology. This symposium was published in book form by the University of Chicago Press in 1964. The speaker is Dr. B.F. Skinner, Professor of Psychology at Harvard University. The title of his presentation is Behaviorism at 50. Here is Dr. Skinner.
Behaviorism, with an accent on the last syllable, is not the scientific study of behavior, but a philosophy of science concerned with the subject matter and methods of psychology. If psychology is a science of mental life, of the mind, of conscious experience, then it must develop and defend a special methodology, which I submit it has not yet done successfully. If it is, on the other hand, a science of the behavior of organisms, human or otherwise, then it is part of biology, a natural science for which tested and highly successful methods are available. The basic issue is not the nature of the stuff of which the world is made, or whether it is made of one stuff or two, but rather the dimensions of the things studied by psychology and the methods relevant to them. Mentalistic or psychic explanations of behavior must almost certainly have originated in primitive animism. When a man dreamt of being at a distant place, in spite of incontrovertible evidence that he had stayed in his bed, it appeared that some part of him had actually left his body. A particularly vivid memory or hallucination could be explained in the same way. And the theory of an invisible, detachable self eventually proved useful for other purposes. It seemed to explain unexpected or abnormal episodes, even to the person behaving in an exceptional way, and it continues to serve this function in some quarters. It also served to explain the inexplicable. The behavior of an organism as complex as man often seems capricious. It is tempting to attribute the behavior of the visible organism to another organism inside, to a little man or homunculus. The wishes of the little man inside become the acts of the man observed by his fellows. The inner idea is put into outer words. Inner feelings find outer expression, and so on. The explanation is successful, of course, only so long as the behavior of the homunculus does not need to be explained. Primitive origins are not necessarily to be held against an explanatory principle, but the little man is still with us in relatively primitive form. He was recently the hero of a television program called Gateways to the Mind, one of a series of educational films sponsored by the Bell Telephone Laboratories and written with the help of a distinguished panel of scientists. The viewer learned from animated cartoons that when a man's finger is pricked, electrical impulses resembling flashes of lightning run up the afferent nerves and appear on the television screen in the brain. There, a little man wakes up, sees the flashing screen, reaches out and pulls a lever. More flashes of lightning go down the nerves to the muscles, which then contract as the finger is pulled away from the threatening stimulus. The behavior of the homunculus was, of course, not explained. An explanation would presumably require another film, and it, in turn, another. Now, I hadn't intended to use visual aids, but this morning's Post presents me with one I can't resist. There is a full-page picture of a very beautiful housewife with a scarf over her hair in curlers. And the text running alongside it is as follows. Somewhere in that head, among the bobby pins, the hairdo, the perfume, and the problems, there is a thing that makes calculations and decisions. This tricky little thinking center is the oldest instrument of progress in the human race. It is never satisfied with today's cut of meat or cut of skirt. Day in and day out, moment by moment over the years, this feminine computer is concerned with one thing above all others, value, which I call to Dr. Rogers' attention. The same pattern of explanation is invoked when we are told that the behavior of a delinquent is the result of his disordered personality, or that the vagaries of a man under analysis are due to conflicts among his superego, ego, and id. Nor can we escape from these primitive features by breaking the little man into pieces and dealing with his wishes, cognitions, motives, and so on, bit by bit. The objection is not that these things are mental, but that they offer no real explanation and stand in the way of a more effective analysis. It has been about 50 years since the behavioristic objection to this practice was first clearly stated, and it has been about 30 years since it was very much discussed. Mr. Koch may be surprised to hear me say that, but as I will point out later, what he talked about as behaviorism was, from my point of view, simply some of the methodology of the science of behavior. He did not deal with the issue that I'm taking up here this morning. A whole generation of psychologists has grown up without really coming into contact with the issue. Almost all current textbooks compromise. Rather than risk a loss of adoptions, they define psychology as the science of behavior and mental life. Meanwhile, the older view continues to receive strong support from areas in which there has been no comparable attempt at methodological reform. A restatement of the position of radical behaviorism would therefore seem to be in order. And I'm not going to talk about neo or neo behaviorism. This is behaviorism. It's pure and simple. A rough history of the idea is not hard to trace. An occasional phrase in classic Greek authors which seem to foreshadow the point of view need not be taken seriously. And we may also pass over the early bravado of a de la Mettrie, who could shock the philosophical bourgeoisie by asserting that man was only a machine, as well as those who, for practical reasons, have simply preferred to deal with behavior rather than with less accessible, but nevertheless acknowledged mental activities. None of these is close to what is meant by behaviorism today. The entering wedge appears to have been Darwin's preoccupation with the continuity of species. In supporting the theory of evolution, it was important to show that man was not essentially different from the lower animals, that every human characteristic, including consciousness and reasoning powers, could be found in other species. Naturalists like Romanes began to collect stories which seemed to show that dogs, cats, elephants, and many other species were conscious and showed signs of reasoning. It was Lloyd Morgan, of course, who questioned this evidence with his canon of parsimony. Were there not other ways of accounting for what looked like signs of consciousness or rational powers? Thorndike's experiments at the end of the century were in this vein. He showed that the behavior of a cat in escaping from a puzzle box might seem to show reasoning, but could be explained instead as the result of simpler processes. Thorndike remained a mentalist, but he greatly advanced the objective study of behavior which had been attributed to mental processes. The next step was inevitable. If evidence of consciousness and reasoning could be explained in other ways in animals, why not also in man? And if this was the case, what became of psychology as a science of mental life? It was John B. Watson, of course, who made the first clear and rather noisy proposal that psychology should be regarded simply as a science of behavior. He was not in a very good position to defend it. He had very little scientific material to use in this reconstruction. He was forced to pad his textbook with discussions of the physiology of receptor systems and muscles, and with physiological theories which were no more susceptible to proof than the mentalistic theories they were intended to replace. A need for mediators of behavior which might serve as objective alternatives to thought processes led him to emphasize subaudible speech. The notion was intriguing because one can usually observe oneself thinking in this way, but it was by no means an adequate or comprehensive explanation. He tangled with introspective psychologists by denying the existence of images. He may well have been acting in good faith, for it has been said, and I think by Lashley, that Watson himself did not have visual imagery, but his arguments caused unnecessary trouble. The relative importance of a genetic endowment in explaining behavior proved to be another disturbing digression. All this made it easy to lose sight of the central argument, that behavior which seemed to be the product of mental activity could be explained in other ways. Moreover, the introspectionists were well prepared to challenge it. As late as 1883, Francis Galton could write, "Many persons, especially women and intelligent children, take pleasure in introspection and strive their very best to explain their mental processes." But introspection was already being taken seriously, and for other reasons. The concept of a science of mind in which mental events obeyed mental laws had led to the development of the psychophysical methods and to the accumulation of certain facts which seemed to bar the extension of the principle of parsimony. What might hold for animals could not hold for men, because men could see their mental processes. Curiously enough, part of the answer to the introspectionists was supplied by the psychoanalysts, who insisted that although a man might be able to see some of his mental life, he could not see all of it. The kinds of thoughts Freud called unconscious took place without the knowledge of the thinker and could be demonstrated in the absence of that knowledge. Thus, from an association, verbal slip, or dream, it could be shown that a person must have responded to a passing stimulus, although he could not tell you that he had done so. The more complex thought processes, including problem solving and verbal play, could also go on without the thinker's knowledge. Freud had devised and never abandoned faith in one of the most elaborate mental apparatuses of all time. He nevertheless contributed to the behavioristic argument by showing that mental activity did not at least require consciousness. His proofs that thinking had occurred without introspective recognition were indeed clearly in the spirit of Lloyd Morgan. They were operational analyses of mental life, even though for Freud only the unconscious part of it. Experimental evidence pointing in the same direction soon began to accumulate. But that was not the whole answer. What about that part of mental life which a man can see? It is a difficult question no matter what one's point of view, partly because it raises the question of what seeing means, and partly because the events seen are private. The fact of privacy cannot, of course, be questioned. Each person is in special contact with a small part of the universe enclosed within his own skin. To take a non-controversial example, he is uniquely subject to certain kinds of proprioceptive and interoceptive stimulation. Though two people may in some sense be said to see the same light or hear the same sound, they cannot feel the same distension of a bile duct or the same bruised muscle. And when privacy is invaded with scientific instruments, the form of stimulation is changed so that the scales read by the scientist are not the private events themselves. A mentalistic psychology insists that there are other kinds of events uniquely accessible to the owner of the skin within which they occur and lacking the physical dimensions of proprioceptive or interoceptive stimuli. They are as different from such physical events as colors are from wavelengths of light. There are even better reasons, therefore, why two people are said not to be able to suffer each other's toothaches, recall each other's memories, or share each other's happinesses. The importance assigned to this kind of world varies. For some, it is the only world there is. For others, it is the only part of the world which can be directly known. For still others, it is a special part of what can be known. In any case, the problem of how one may know about the subjective world of another must be faced. Apart from the question of what knowing means, the problem is one of accessibility. One solution, often regarded as behavioristic, is to grant the distinction between public and private events and rule the latter out of scientific consideration. This is a congenial solution for those to whom scientific truth is a matter of convention or agreement among observers. The principal methodological question raised by privacy is how certain kinds of events can be brought within the reach of public science. This was essentially the line taken by logical positivism and by physical operationism. Hogben has recently redefined behaviorist in this spirit. The subtitle of his statistical theory is an examination of the contemporary crises in statistical theory from a behaviorist viewpoint. And this is amplified in the following way. The behaviorist, as I here use the term, does not deny the convenience of classifying processes as mental or material. He recognizes the distinction between personality and corpse, but he has not yet had the privilege of attending an identity parade in which human minds without bodies are by common recognition distinguishable from living human bodies without minds. The behaviorist position so defined is simply that of the publicist and has no concern with structure and mechanism. The point of view is often called operational, and it is significant that P.W. Bridgman's physical operationism could not save him from an extreme solipsism even within physical science itself. Though he insisted that he was not a solipsist, he was never able to reconcile seemingly public physical knowledge with the private world of the scientist, as Mr. Koch pointed out yesterday. The introduction of Bridgman's book on this theme, The Way Things Are, mentions the fact that a good deal of it came out of discussions that Bridgman and I had on this issue, and I think I should report for the record that the question that bothered him most was one which Mr. McLeod dismissed yesterday as meaningless. Many at the time we have finally come around to the same old question, and he would say to me, "But how do I know that what you see as green is not what I see as red?" Applied to psychological problems, operationism has been no more successful. We may recognize the restrictions imposed by the operations through which we know of the existence or properties of subjective events, but the operations cannot be identified with the events themselves. S.S. Stevens has applied Bridgman's principle to psychology not to decide whether subjective events exist, but to determine the extent to which we can deal with them scientifically. Various behaviorists have from time to time examined the nature of our knowledge of subjective events and have emphasized some of the problems raised by the fact of privacy. And some of them have excluded so-called sensations, images, thought processes, and so on from their deliberations. When they do this, not because such things do not exist, but because they are out of reach of their methods, the charge is justified that they have neglected the problem of consciousness. The strategy is, however, quite unwise. It is particularly important that a science of behavior face the problem of privacy, and it may do so without abandoning the basic position of behaviorism. Science often talks about things it cannot see or measure. When a man tosses a penny into the air, it must be assumed that to some extent he tosses the earth beneath him downward. It is quite out of the question to see or measure the effect on the earth, but it must be assumed for the sake of a consistent account. An adequate science of behavior must often consider events taking place within the skin of the organism, not as physiological mediators of behavior, but as behavior itself. And it can deal with these events without assuming that they have any special nature or must be known in any special way. It assumes merely that private and public events have the same kind of physical dimensions. In the 50 years which have passed since a behavioristic philosophy was first stated, facts and principles bearing on the basic issues have steadily accumulated. For one thing, a scientific analysis of behavior has yielded a sort of empirical epistemology. In the long run, the subject matter of a science of behavior must include the behavior of scientists and other knowers. The special techniques available in such a science give an empirical theory of knowledge certain advantages over theories derived from philosophy and logic. The problem of privacy may be approached in a fresh direction by starting with behavior rather than with immediate experience. The stratagem is certainly no more arbitrary or circular than the earlier practice, and it has a surprising result. Instead of concluding that man can know only his subjective experiences, that he is bound forever to his private world, and that the external world is actually a mere construct, a behavioral theory of knowledge suggests that it is the private world which, if not entirely unknowable, is at least not likely to be known well. The relations between organism and environment which are involved in knowing are of such a sort that the privacy of the world within the skin imposes more serious limitations on personal knowledge than on scientific accessibility. An organism learns to react discriminatively to the world around it under certain contingencies of reinforcement. Thus, in a simple example, a child learns to name a color correctly when a given response is reinforced in the presence of the color and extinguished in its absence. The verbal community may make the reinforcement of an extensive repertoire of responses contingent on subtle properties of colored stimuli. We have every reason to believe that the child will not discriminate among colors, that he will not see two colors as different until exposed to such contingencies. So far as we know, the same process of differential reinforcement is required if a child is to distinguish among the events occurring within his own skin. Many contingencies involving private stimuli need not be arranged by a verbal community, for they follow from simple mechanical relations among stimuli, responses, and reinforcing consequences. The various motions which comprise turning a handspring, for example, are under the control of external and internal stimuli and subject to external and internal reinforcing consequences. But the performer is not necessarily aware of the stimuli controlling his behavior, no matter how appropriate and skillful it may be. Knowing or being aware of what is happening in turning a handspring involves discriminative responses, such as naming or describing, which arise from contingencies arranged by a verbal environment. Such environments are common. The community is generally interested in what a man is doing or has done or is planning to do and why. And it arranges contingencies which generate verbal responses which are said to name and describe the external and internal stimuli associated with these events. It challenges a man's verbal behavior by asking, "How do you know?" And the speaker can answer, if at all, only by describing some of the variables of which his verbal behavior has been a function. The awareness resulting from all this is a social product. In attempting to set up such a repertoire, however, the verbal community works under a severe handicap. It cannot always arrange the contingencies required for subtle discriminations. It cannot teach a child to call one pattern of private stimuli diffidence and another embarrassment as effectively as it teaches him to call one stimulus red and another orange. The verbal community cannot be sure of the presence or absence of the private patterns of stimuli appropriate to the reinforcement or lack of reinforcement of such responses. Privacy thus causes trouble, first of all, for the verbal community. The individual suffers in turn. Because the community cannot reinforce self-descriptive responses consistently, a person cannot describe or otherwise know events occurring within his own skin as subtly and precisely as he knows events in the world at large. There are, of course, differences between external and internal stimuli, which are not mere differences in location. Internal stimuli may have a certain intimacy. They are likely to be especially familiar. They are very much with us. We cannot escape from a toothache as easily as from a deafening noise. They may well be of special kinds. The stimuli we feel in pride or sorrow, for example, may not closely resemble those we feel in sandpaper or satin. But this does not mean that they differ in physical status. In particular, it does not mean that they can be more easily or more directly known. Quite the contrary. What is particularly clear and familiar to the potential knower may be strange and distant to the verbal community which is responsible for his knowing. What are the private events which, at least in a limited way, a man may come to respond to in ways we call knowing? Let us begin with the oldest and in many ways the most difficult kind, represented by the stubborn fact of consciousness. What is happening when a person observes the conscious content of his mind, when he looks at his sensations or images? Western philosophy and science have been handicapped in answering these questions by an unfortunate metaphor. The Greeks could not explain how a man could have knowledge of something with which he was not in immediate contact. How could he know an object on the other side of the room, for example? Did he reach out and touch it with some sort of invisible probe? Or did he never actually come into contact with the object at all, but only with a copy of it inside his body? Plato supported the copy theory with his metaphor of the cave. Perhaps a man never sees the real world at all, but only shadows of it on the wall of the cave in which he is imprisoned. The shadows may very well have been the much more accurate copies of the outside world in a camera obscura, and I wonder whether Plato knew of a cave at the entrance of which a happy superposition of objects might have admitted the thin pencils of light needed for a camera obscura. In any case, copies of the real world projected into the body could compose the experience which a man directly knows. And a similar theory could also explain how one can see objects which are not really there, as in hallucinations, after images, and memories. Neither explanation is, of course, really satisfactory. How a copy may arise at a distance is at least as puzzling as how a man may know an object at a distance. And seeing things which are not really there is no harder to explain than the occurrence of copies of things not there to be copied. The search for copies of the world within the body, particularly in the nervous system, still goes on, however, but with discouraging results. If the retina could suddenly be developed like a photographic plate, it would yield a poor picture, and the nerve impulses in the optic tract must have an even more tenuous resemblance to, quote, what is seen, unquote. The patterns of vibrations which strike our ear when we listen to music are quickly lost in transmission. The bodily reactions to substances tasted, smelled, and touched would scarcely qualify as faithful reproductions. These facts are discouraging for those who are looking for copies of the real world within the body, but they are fortunate for psychophysiology as a whole. At some point, the organism must do more than create duplicates. It must see, hear, smell, and so on as forms of action rather than of reproduction. It must do some of the things it is differentially reinforced for doing when it learned to respond discriminatively. And the sooner the pattern of the external world disappears after impinging on the organism, the sooner the organism may begin to get on with these other functions. The need for something beyond and quite different from copying is not, however, widely understood. Suppose someone were to coat the occipital lobes of the brain with a special photographic emulsion, which, when developed, yielded a reasonable copy of a current visual stimulus. In many quarters, this would be regarded as a triumph in the physiology of vision. Yet nothing could be more disastrous, for we should have to start all over again and ask how the organism sees a picture in its occipital cortex. And we should now have much less of the brain available in which to seek an answer. It adds nothing to an explanation of how an organism reacts to a stimulus to trace the pattern of the stimulus into the body. It is most convenient for both organism and psychophysiologist if the external world is never copied, if the world we know is simply the world around us. The same may be said of theories according to which the brain interprets signals sent to it and in some sense reconstructs external stimuli. If the real world is indeed scrambled in transmission but later reconstructed in the brain, we must then start all over again and explain how the organism sees the reproduction. An adequate treatment of this point would require a thorough analysis of the behavior of seeing and of the conditions under which we see, if I may continue with this sensory modality as a convenient example. It would be unwise to exaggerate our success. Discriminative visual behavior arises from contingencies involving external stimuli and overt responses differentially reinforced with respect to them, but possible private accompaniments must not be overlooked. Some of the consequences of such contingencies seem well established. It is usually easiest for us to see a friend when we are looking at him, because visual stimuli, similar to those present when the behavior was acquired, exert maximal control over the response. But mere visual stimulation is not enough. Even after having been exposed to the necessary history of reinforcement, we may not see a friend who is present unless we have reason to do so. On the other hand, if the reasons are strong enough, we may see him in someone bearing only a superficial resemblance, or when no one like him is present at all. If conditions favor seeing something else, we may behave accordingly. If on a hunting trip it is important to us to see a deer, we may glance toward our friend at a distance, see him as a deer, and shoot. It is not, however, seeing our friend which raises the question of conscious content, but seeing that we are seeing him. And there are no natural contingencies for such behavior. We learn to see that we are seeing only because a verbal community arranges for us to do so. We usually acquire the behavior when we are under appropriate visual stimulation, but it does not follow that the thing seen must be present when we see that we are seeing it. The contingencies arranged by the verbal environment may set up self-descriptive responses describing the behavior of seeing even when the thing seen is not present. If seeing does not always require the presence of things seen, we need not be concerned about certain mental processes said to be involved in the construction of such things, images, memories, and dreams, for example. We may regard a dream not as a display of things seen by the dreamer, but simply as the behavior of seeing. At no time during a daydream, for example, should we expect to find within the organism anything which corresponds to the external stimuli present when the dreamer first acquired the behavior in which he is now engaged. In simple recall, we need not suppose that we wander through some storehouse of memory until we find an object which we then contemplate. Instead of assuming that we begin with a tendency to recognize such an object once it is found, it is simpler to assume that we begin with a tendency to see it. Techniques of self-management which facilitate recall, for example, the use of mnemonic devices, can be formulated as ways of strengthening behavior rather than of creating objects to be seen. Freud dramatized the issue with respect to night dreaming in his concept of dream work, an activity in which some part of the dreamer played the role of a theatrical producer while another part sat in the audience. If a dream is indeed something seen, then we must suppose that it is wrought as such. But if it is simply the behavior of seeing, the dream work may be dropped from the analysis. It took man a long time to understand that when he dreamt of a wolf, no wolf was actually there. It has taken him much longer to understand that not even a representation of a wolf need be there. The heart of the behavioristic position on conscious experience may be summed up in this way. Seeing does not imply something seen. We acquire the behavior of seeing under stimulation from actual objects, but it may occur in the absence of these objects under the control of other variables. We also acquire the behavior of seeing that we are seeing when we are seeing actual objects, but this second level kind of seeing may also occur in the absence of such objects. To question the reality or the nature of the things seen in conscious experience is not to question the value of introspective psychology or its methods. Current problems in sensation are mainly concerned with the physiological function of receptors and associated neural mechanisms.